Hello ladies and gentlemen, this is Philosophossum. Hope everyone enjoyed their new year, or new decade I should say. And you know what, I figured what better way to start off this prosperous new decade of ours than by trying something different. Thus far on this channel I've been responding to videos, and I figured, well, I'll shake up the status quo a bit. This time I'll be responding to an article. This article is entitled, Why Taxation is Not Theft, and it's written by a gentleman named Robert Nielsen from the UK. So I'm basically going to break this down paragraph by paragraph, point by point, and just kind of dissect it. And of course I will be providing a link to the article in the description, just that way you can verify that I'm not misquoting or taking anything out of context. That being said, let's begin. Alright, so Mr. Nielsen begins by writing the following. Just as all political debates inevitably end with someone making a Hitler comparison, all debates with libertarians sooner or later involve the claim that taxation is theft. It doesn't matter whether you are discussing the welfare state, universal health care, or a TV license. Alright, so for those of you who aren't aware, in Britain, it's actually required that you own a license from the government in order to own a television set. I'm not sure whether or not they still do this. Any of my British viewers out there, if you could fill me in on that. But supposedly the reason they did this is to help fund their state-run media, the BBC. Now, how the hell you would enforce this is beyond me, especially nowadays that you don't even need a TV to watch TV anymore. You can stream on pretty much any different kind of device. Needless to say, the concept is kind of stupid, but anyways, continuing. At some point, a libertarian will accuse the government of acting like the mafia and stealing people's money. Well, let's think about it for a minute. What deal do you get from the mafia? Pay us and we'll protect you, don't and bad things will happen. What deal do you get from government? Pay us and we'll protect you, don't and bad things will happen. The only difference really is that the warning letter you get from government isn't made from cut-up magazines. Continuing. Just the last day a commenter asked me to stop promoting the use of force against me or my family, by which he meant don't regulate Bitcoin. Well, first of all, I'm not sure how you would regulate Bitcoin. It's virtually untraceable. Second of all, I believe the point this commenter was trying to get across is that all regulations are basically violence. And this is something I feel authoritarians often forget or don't really think about, is that when you say there should be a law or regulation in place, what you're saying is that it is justified for the government to use any amount of force, up to and including lethal, to stop people from doing this. So I may not like that somebody's doing something, or may not like that a business is doing something a particular way, or may prefer they do it a different way, but at the same time you kind of have to weigh that against, okay, would I stick a gun at their face, or would I do something that would escalate the violence over this? Continuing. Of course, we all know that this argument is melodramatic hyperbole. Well, not really. I mean, it's based on logic. I mean, if you're taking money from someone else, whether or not they agree to it, then that's theft. There's no way to opt out of paying taxes. There's no way to revoke my consent. So it's essentially theft. Now, you may think we're being hyperbolic or overdramatic about it, but that doesn't change the underlying logic or facts that taking someone else's money, whether or not they consent to it, whatever you call yourself, a business, government, whatever, that's essentially theft. Continuing. But it would be useful to spell out why. Let me use an analogy that I think will best get the point across. Think of taxes as like paying rent. The state owns the land, except they don't. I don't know, maybe over there in Britain, the government owns all the property within its territory, but I definitely know here in the United States, yeah, that's definitely not the case. And if you want to live on the land, you must pay rent. Except the state doesn't own all the land within its territory. That's kind of the assumption that this analogy is making. If I own my own property, why the hell should I have to pay someone else for the right to live on it? That's essentially what property taxes are. Property taxes are you basically being forced to pay the government for permission to live on your own property. In fact, if you think about it, land ownership is kind of a raw deal under the state, because think about it, you have all the same responsibilities of a tenant. You have to pay rent or property taxes. You have to obey, the zoning laws. The state's basically a landlord. You own the property, but you still have to pay the state, follow their rules. Basically, you have all the responsibilities of tenantship without any of the benefits. Continuing. The state is like a shopping center, or shopping mall for my American readers. I don't know about that. Last I checked, shopping malls didn't force you to do business with them against your will, or locked you into a cage if you refused. Continuing. If you want to enter it, you must agree to abide by its rules. But the shopping mall is owned privately, so the owner has some sort of justification for the rules that he creates for it. That business came about because of the owner's, hard work, labor, time, risk-taking, and because of that, it's theirs to do with as they please. Continuing. If you refuse, you will be punished by the security guards. Alright, but again, I don't think the state comparison is necessarily apt because the rules that they're enforcing are legitimate because they come from the owner's right to create those rules. And security guards can only enforce those rules, they don't have authority over that particular mall. They can't boss you around on your own property. And even then, even on the mall's property, their power to punish you isn't absolute. Like, they can remove you from the premises. They may even be able to ban you from returning, but they can't, say, cage you or beat you to a bloody pulp. Continuing, if you don't like this shopping center, go to a different one instead. A libertarian may complain that this is unfair because no matter where they will go, they will have to live in a state and therefore be subject to someone's rules, but if you refuse to go to one shopping center, you will have to go to one somewhere. Well, not necessarily. You can go to a store that's not in a shopping mall, or you can go to, say, a local flea market or a garage sale, or you can shop online. That's one of the nice things about the free market, is that there's seldom only a certain way to do something. If one way of doing things doesn't suit your fancy, you're free to try any multitude of other things. Continuing. Likewise, if we abolished the state, then no matter where you went, you would still be on someone else's private property and therefore subject to their rules. Except you can also be on your own property and therefore only be subject to your own rules. Or to phrase the problem a different way, if I don't like what any business is doing, I'd be free to start my own. Whereas if I don't like what a government is doing or what any other government is doing, there's no real way for me to start my own government. Well, I suppose I technically could, but it's much easier to start your own business. Continuing, it's not theft if you receive something in return. Okay, Mr. Nielsen, if a burglar breaks into your house, ransacks everything, but leaves behind a cum-soaked Playboy, you have no right to complain. Continuing, if someone steals my car, that is theft. If I have to sell my car in order to pay my rent, that is not theft. Well, I mean, not if you're making the conscious decision to sell your own car, but if someone else, say, sells your car for you or forces you to sell your car, then yeah, that's kind of theft. The other problem with this analogy is that you can decide whether or not to pay your rent. If you think that your rent is too high, or you would rather keep your car than pay your rent, or if you think that perhaps by living somewhere else it's cheaper, you can ultimately end up keeping your car, you have the flexibility to make that decision, whereas with taxation, you don't really have that. If the IRS wants you to sell your car to pay your taxes, you're SOL. Continuing, libertarians sometimes act as though taxes disappear into a black hole and are never seen again. Has this guy seen how the government spends money? I don't know, maybe over there in the UK they're a bit more fiscally responsible, but I know over here in the US, the government just blows money on all kinds of shit. I mean, the debt increases on a second-wise basis, for fuck's sake. Continuing, in reality, we receive from the government protection and a commitment to justice. A commitment to justice. There are states where the bail for selling drugs is higher than the bail for murder. Continuing, we also receive education, healthcare, transportation, safe food, employment protection, and enforcement of contracts. Alright, so the private sector can and often does provide these same services. In fact, when done so by the private sector, they're not only cheaper but better quality. This is because, in the case of the private sector, I have a choice of which firm I do business with. If I don't like the way one firm is doing something, I can choose another one. So they're incentivized to provide the highest quality at the lowest price simply because they want to get your business. Contrast this with the state. Their income is more or less guaranteed because there's no way to opt out of paying taxes. So when your business is coerced, there's little to no incentive to make sure you're providing the highest quality at the lowest price. Continuing, there's also redistribution and welfare in the event of sickness, poverty, and old age. So libertarians make the bizarre argument that the government is a thief who gives more than he steals. Except what we argue is that that's impossible. Anyone with even a basic understanding of economics knows that there's no way, at least no sustainable way, that you can give out more resources than you take in. So a lot of people get this idea from one place or another that the government can create resources when they advocate for free healthcare, free education, free this, free that. They often, I feel, are forgetting that the resources to provide this free stuff have to come from somewhere. Continuing, due to economic inequality, most people receive more than they pay in taxes. Yeah, that may be true for most people, but for certain people, they're actually getting less than they pay. They're essentially being screwed over. People are piggybacking off of them. And one thing I always found strange is that supposedly one of the reasons we need taxation is to prevent freeloading, yet at the same time, a lot of people argue that, acknowledge or often advocate for the system enabling people to freeload. And this raises that same problem I mentioned a moment ago, is that you can't at least sustainably, give out more resources than you take in, and it would appear that this system as it currently works has a single point of failure. It relies on certain wealthy individuals being able to pay more than they receive. Problem is, again, that creates a single point of failure. Suppose that these people either have all their money taken or they say fuck that shit and move their assets overseas, you got a problem. I forget who said it, but there's a famous quote from an economist. The problem with socialism is that eventually you run out of other people's money. Continuing. Furthermore, what sort of thief lets you decide how your money is spent or how much he takes? Alright, well, this is confusion about the definition of theft. Theft is by definition taking someone else's property without their consent. The only relevant criteria that this raises is whether or not the original owner is parting of the property of their own volition. Sure, if the thief lets me decide how the money's spent or how much he takes, well, that's all fine and dandy, but if the transaction is coerced, that's still theft. Continuing. If I told a car thief that myself and the neighbors had decided that he shouldn't take my car, would he listen? Well, I don't see how the opinion of your neighbors comes into play at all. I mean, it's your car. You're the one who owns it. And one of the implications of your argument is that if your neighbors thumbs up it, then the thief will listen and take your car, which your neighbors ought not to have the power to do because, again, it's your car. Continuing. Yet the government is subject to the will of the people. Yeah, right. We choose whether we want our taxes to be higher or lower when we vote. Well, that assumes that a candidate is running who has taxation as part of their platform. Because, remember, you're not voting on specific policies, you're voting on platforms. If a politician isn't running who proposes either higher or lower taxes, then this argument wouldn't really hold any weight. And even if there was a candidate running who proposed to, say, raise or lower taxes, well, that still doesn't guarantee anything because politicians aren't actually obligated to follow through with their promises. Like I mentioned a moment ago, because the government is guaranteed funding, because taxation isn't optional, there's very little incentive for politicians to actually, follow through with what they promise. Continuing. Based on the failure of libertarians to win elections, most people seem quite content with taxation. Well, again, that may not necessarily be because of people like taxation, that may be because a libertarian candidate isn't running. There's nothing stopping a libertarian party from being set up and winning an election, except maybe the strong bipartisan establishment and the lack of wealthy influential donors to fund the campaign. Continuing. If taxation really was theft, then such a party would easily win a landslide and could promptly end the theft. Well, this is an example of the argumentum ad populum fallacy. Yeah, just because an idea is popular doesn't mean it's true or correct or justified. There was times when a majority of people were content with slavery and genocide, but that doesn't mean these things are morally right. If everybody in the country except for one person approved of taxation, it would still be theft if you took it from that one person. Continuing. A key element of the definition of theft is that the victim does not consent to it. But if people do not vote for parties that promise to reduce taxes, but instead for parties that keep taxes at the current level, then must not consider themselves the victims of theft. They must consent to taxes. Okay, well, here's the problem with that. Elections are a one-size-fits-all process. Whatever the result of an election is imposed on everybody across the board. So if people vote to have higher taxes, everybody pays those higher taxes, even the people who didn't vote for the higher taxes. So at best, this argument would conclude that taxes are not theft for certain people, not that taxes are not theft across the board. Continuing. But a libertarian would argue that they never agreed to this. Even if they receive more than they pay, they never consented to pay anything. But that is an implicit part of citizenship. Being a citizen comes with rights and responsibilities. You have a right to protection and certain services, but also a responsibility to pay for those services. You have a right to vote, but a responsibility to accept the result if your party does not win. Well, that's all fine and dandy, but that still leaves the original problem. I never consented to being a citizen. Yeah, sure, there are responsibilities and perks that come with it, but I was never given the option to weigh those responsibilities against the benefits and determine whether or not being a citizen is in my interest. It may very well be the case that citizenship is worthwhile and that the freedoms you give up are worth the benefits you gain from it, but it wouldn't really matter since I never have a choice in the matter. Continuing. Sure, I never consented to being a citizen of Ireland, but then again, I never consented to capitalism either. Well, you're kind of comparing apples to oranges here. Citizenship is something that's imposed on you whether or not you agree to it. Well, at least in most countries. Like I know in the United States we have birthright citizenship, but most instances citizenship is something that is imposed on you, and either there's no way to opt out or the active burden is on you to opt out of being a citizen. Now, capitalism, on the other hand, is by definition based on consent. It is the free exchange of goods and services in the market. So, by definition, capitalism is something you have to consent to. Continuing. I never agreed to live in a society with democracy or private property. Okay, well again, private property is something that you by definition have to consent to. That's the only way to obtain private property. If you don't consent to private property, then you don't own it. So this is again mental gymnastics here. Continuing. I never agreed to elections being held every 5 years or the current distribution of property. Alright, so distribution of property again is based on consent. People own things because they agreed to accept them or the previous owner agreed to give them away. But I'm assuming that the author in this context is saying the overall distribution of property, like what people have. Well, in order to determine that, you would have to override the property rights of the other people who own that stuff, which you don't have any rational basis to do. Continuing. Do we have to have a social revolution every time someone disagrees with the way things are? Well, I suppose not, but you're stuck in this mindset of there has to be one system for everybody. What I believe in is something called panarchism. It's the idea that different political systems should exist and you should be allowed to pick which one to live under. So for example, anarcho-capitalism would exist and minarchism would exist and socialism, democracy, it would all exist and you'd have your right to choose which you'd prefer to live under. It's like a free market of governments. Continuing. The fact is that there are a lot of things we have never agreed to but have to live with. Alright, well this is the is therefore ought fallacy. Yeah, sure, as the way things currently are, you have no choice in certain matters. You have things imposed on you against your will. That doesn't mean it's necessarily the ideal way of doing things. The way things work under the current political paradigm is that you have systems imposed onto you, whether or not you agree to them, where what I propose under panarchism is the opposite. You would agree to the political system that you live under. Continuing. We have to live under some sort of political and economic system that will be to some extent arbitrary, but simply isn't feasible to have everyone make up their own rules. Well, I'll agree with you on that. It is impossible to have a system where everybody can just make up their own rules for themselves, but the libertarian solution to that is simple. Rather than letting certain people just make the rules for everybody, we make some sort of appeal to something objective, something that's true for everybody across the board, and that is logic. Logic is equally applicable across the board and unchanging. So the non-aggression principle, the natural law, the stuff that libertarians propose, is based on logic. It overcomes this problem by being universalizable. The philosopher Immanuel Kant said that an ideal system of ethics is universalizable, and I agree with him on that. And if you agree that every political system or economic system is arbitrary to an extent, well, wouldn't that be an argument against, a one-size-fits-all solution? As far as I'm concerned, that's an argument in favor of panarchism, or a system where people are free to decide, what would work best for them. There isn't an objective right way of doing things. That's why we libertarians believe in freedom of choice. Continuing. The problem with most libertarian arguments is that it assumes we have only rights but no responsibilities. Alright, well this isn't true. As a matter of fact, rights entail responsibilities. For example, your right to your life entails a responsibility not to kill. Your right to your property comes with a responsibility not to steal or vandalize. Anytime you claim a right to something, there's an implicit responsibility to respect that right for others. Rights aren't a cafeteria. You can't just respect your own rights but not give a crap about other people's, because at that point, rights become arbitrary. The concept of right breaks down once you decide that you can obey your own rights but violate others. This problem is evident in how the democratic system works as far as taxation goes. You see, nobody wants to be forced to pay for something they don't want to, but everybody wants to force other people to pay for stuff they want to. And that's kind of what happens when you vote. You're saying, well, I don't want to be forced to pay for stuff I don't want to, but other people should, and that's why the idea of property rights can't be applied consistently within this paradigm. Continuing. It assumes we have no duties to the poor, the sick, the elderly, or even children. Alright, so what the author is discussing here is the concept of positive rights. The idea that you should not only be entitled to the right to something, but actually to that something. So a right to health care in the positive sense would mean not just the right to seek out health care uninhibited, but also the right to actually get health care. There's a problem inherent to positive rights that a lot of people who advocate for them don't realize, that it logically entails slavery. If you're entitled to something in the positive sense, then that means you're entitled to the labor needed to create it. And if you're entitled to somebody else's labor, then that's essentially slavery. To be entitled to something means that you can ultimately have it, no questions asked, and you can use any means necessary to obtain it. For rights in the negative sense, this doesn't really raise any issues. You have a right to your own life, your own property. When you start claiming a right to other people's stuff, well, that's when things get dicey. Now, just because there's no inherent obligation to take care of the poor, sick, elderly, whatever, that doesn't mean people don't. As a matter of fact, charitable spending is actually highest in countries that are more economically free. Now, as far as children goes, that's a bit different, since many would argue that child rearing is a responsibility you voluntarily agree to. So children, it's a bit more of a gray area as far as that goes, but the point to take away here is that positive rights can't be applied logically consistently, at least not if you believe slavery is wrong. But continuing, if a man was starving and a libertarian had 2 loaves of bread, he wouldn't share it with the man unless he felt like it. Well, yeah, this is kind of a non sequitur. I mean, nobody does anything unless they feel like it. Whether or not someone feels like giving bread to the homeless man will depend on whether or not they're a sociopath. And perhaps the reason they're not giving bread to the homeless man may not have anything to do with sociopathology. It may be that they have their own starving family to feed. This is something the left does frequently. They try to paint anyone who doesn't give to charity or agree with welfare as, greedy or selfish. Continuing, we do have responsibilities to others in society, and the government exists to enforce them. Okay, yeah, we do have responsibilities to others in society, but those responsibilities exist in a negative sense. You have a responsibility not to kill anybody, not to hurt anybody, not to interfere with other people's property. Like as mentioned a moment ago, there's no real way to advocate for positive rights or positive obligations to others in society without appealing to slavery, and the government exists to enforce them. Well, considering the government violates your rights all over the place, I'd have reason to doubt that, but the government isn't the only possible entity that can enforce these rights or these obligations. Private sector security and arbitration not only exists, but typically does a better job than government services. Continuing, our common humanity unites us and means that the suffering of others is our suffering too. We cannot rest easy if the streets outside our house are full of destitute. Okay, so you believe that a common humanity, unites us and that people can't rest easy if there's poor and destitute outside. So you believe that people, as a matter of common humanity, want to help and support each other, but you still believe that we need coercion in order for that to happen. I agree that we're united by a common sense of humanity and that suffering and destitute, people on the streets, that nobody wants that, so people naturally will contribute to helping these people without coercion. Continuing, a libertarian world would be a cold and empty one, where people sit alone counting their money, blind to poverty, hunger, and misery, which is why literal billions are donated to charity every year. How much of the money you donate to charity do you think actually makes it to the poor versus money that goes through the government? Because most charities are non-profit. They only care about keeping their operating costs, their lights on. Where government has all this big bureaucratic machinery of politicians who chances are could give rat's ass about the poor but are using them as a, campaign fodder. Under which system do you think more of what you donate, a larger percentage of it, actually makes it to helping whatever cause it is you're supporting? Continuing, libertarians make the mistake of thinking of people as isolated individuals, isolated from the rest of the world. No, we're against coerced interaction. We're not against any and all interaction, period. People get this weird idea in their heads that because libertarians think interactions should be voluntary means that we're somehow antisocial, or think people should be super individualist. Continuing, they act as though I and I alone earn my wage and therefore it belongs to no one else. Well, yeah, that's true. When I entered into the agreement with my employer, they agreed to work for them in return for a certain pay. Now, if someone else wanted in on that pay that I earned, they'd have to also join in on the agreement. So unless stipulated otherwise in the employment agreement, yes, I and I alone earned my paycheck. Continuing, in reality, we are hugely dependent on others and society. Okay, libertarians aren't advocating for a cottage economy where everybody does their own everything. We are well aware that a modern society is enabled by interdependence. What we want is a choice on who we do business with. Continuing, would we earn anywhere near enough money if we did not have public roads, education, health, energy, etc.? Well, I suppose not, but those things can be provided by the private sector, and as I already mentioned, when done so, they're often higher quality, because you have a choice. Continuing, I did not create everything myself, but instead built on the work of previous generations and worked alongside other members of society. No man is an island, and there is no such thing as a self-made person. In reality, we are standing on the shoulders of giants. We got to where we are today due in large part to the society that we live in. Okay, I can't say I disagree with that necessarily, but society and government aren't the same thing. You can have interdependence and social interaction and people working together to achieve a common goal without a state or without coercion. Continuing, so it is only fair that we pay something to support it. Alright, so this guy's making the mistake of treating society as if it's some kind of monolith, as if every time I do business or interact with people, I'm somehow doing business or interacting with every other single person who lives in the geographical area. So societies aren't monoliths, they're fluid entities, they're ecosystems of people interacting. There's no definite person or group of people you can just call society. Like, okay, you're trying to argue that I'm obligated to pay society for, what they've done for me. Okay, I'm gonna just pull out my checkbook and I'll write a check, I'll cut it out to society. Yeah, and I'll put it in society's bank account. Yeah, it doesn't really work that way. Continuing. If you don't believe me, compare your life to what it would be if you lived in a third world country. Isn't it worth paying to avoid that? Well, perhaps it is, but would we necessarily be having to pay the state though? Especially considering the fact that when you look at the data, countries that are more economically free, less taxes and regulation, typically perform better in every metric, whether it be GDP, average household income, happiness, health of the environment, pretty much every way. And if you look at these so-called third world countries that we should not strive to be like, you'll often see heavy-handed government, high taxes. Perhaps it is worth paying to avoid, but the question is, paying whom and for what? Continuing. In reality, libertarians do not truly object to coercion or taxes. They only object to the government doing so. Oh dear lord, this old thing again. Yeah, contrary to popular belief, libertarians are equally opposed to government and private sector violations of people's rights. The reason we tend to be critical of government is because people perceive in government some kind of special right to violate rights that no private sector entity has. The reason we give government careful scrutiny compared to the private sector is because most people feel compelled to do the opposite. Continuing. If a private landlord compelled people to live by onerous rules about drugs, guns, and religion, libertarians would have no problem. Yeah, because the landlord owns the property and you're not forced to live there. And if you think his rules are too onerous, you can leave and live under a different landlord who has more lenient rules. Continuing. Yet when the government does the same thing, libertarians are up in arms and crying oppression. Well, because the government doesn't own all the property within its territory, not all of the laws it creates have any sort of basis for justification. So a landlord can only create rules for property that they own, but the state can, tell you can't grow drugs, or they impose zoning laws, building codes. Even though it's your property, you still have to follow their rules. Continuing. If a starving man agreed to work for half the normal wages because otherwise he would die, a libertarian praises the free market. Okay, but what are normal wages? Labor, just like any other commodity in the market, the price is determined by supply and demand. There's no such thing as an objective normal price. This is a manipulation of words to try and tug at your sympathy. If a man has to pay half his wages in taxes without which he would die, a libertarian is outraged. Well, yes, you would die without taxes, because if you don't pay, they send agents to your house with guns to kidnap you into a cage, and if you resist this kidnapping, as you would have the right to do against a private sector entity doing the exact same thing on the same basis, guess what? There's a bullet with your name on it. So yeah, that's probably the one thing he gets right in this article. Continuing. Every abuse of government power that a libertarian rails against would still occur in a libertarian society. The only difference would be that it would be even worse. If government was replaced by a private landlord, there would be just as much coercion and arbitrary rules. So according to this guy, if we abolish the state, a landlord would just step in and take over. Does this guy know how landlords work? They only have authority over their own property, and they only have authority over tenants insofar as those tenants agree to that authority. The only way for a landlord to take over in the absence of a state is if everybody within the country agreed to sell their land to that landlord, which seems unlikely to me, but who knows? Continuing. Without any of the democratic rights we currently have. Well, actually, I'd argue you have even more democratic rights, because now in this case, the landlord is directly held accountable by the tenants. If the landlord is an asshole or not, maintaining the premises properly, you can move out, or you can negotiate to have the terms of the lease change, and you wouldn't need permission from the other tenants. That's if we had a democratic type landlord, here's how it would work. You would be forced to live in a certain building whether you wanted to or not, and if any sort of decision you wanted to make, like let's say you wanted the terms of lease to be different, or rent should be higher, lower, whatever, you'd have to have the approval of all the other neighbors. Contrast that with a system where you're free to opt in and out, and regardless of what the opinion of everyone else is. Which do you think would be a better deal? Continuing. The very notion of property is dependent on the state. This has been debunked so many times I don't even really feel like beating this dead horse, but I'll do it anyway. You own yourself. You own your time and labor. You own the results of your time and labor. Therefore, you own your property. No state necessary. Sure, you may argue that a state is needed to enforce your property rights, but a state isn't needed to create or have property rights. Continuing. Without which we would be reduced to the endless strife and the rule of the strongest, which is why private security typically does a better job of stopping crime than government police. Continuing. Taxes are payment to support civilization and avoid a descent into anarchy. Okay, well here's a common misconception about anarchy. Anarchy means without rulers, not without rules. Just because there's no centralized, system of justice doesn't mean there's no justice. In fact, many people would argue because under anarchy the rules aren't subject to change on a whim, there'd be more stability rather than less. Continuing. Theft is the taking of assets from people without their consent and giving nothing in return. I'm pretty sure only the former has to do with it. As I've mentioned before, if somebody mugs you on the street but hands you a moldy sandwich in return, I don't think that would be of much consolation. Continuing. Taxes, on the other hand, are consented to by citizens, as seen by their continual support for taxation parties and their refusal to vote for libertarian parties or move to tax havens. Well, again, only the majority consent to the taxation, so that's best case scenario an argument that taxation isn't theft for most people. That it's not theft, period. And while I'll be the first to admit that yes, there are a handful of countries that don't have taxes, you're kind of putting the burden on the wrong person. The person taking my money or claiming the right to take my money is the active party. They're the ones who have to justify their actions. The passive person, the person who just wants to live on their own property, there's no burden on them to justify that. So yes, while I can move to, say, Monaco or the Cayman Islands or Somalia to avoid paying taxes, that doesn't mean that that burden should be on me. Continuing. In exchange for services, citizens choose the level of taxes and where they go, as well as consenting to abide by majority rule if their preferred option is not selected, except I don't remember ever consenting to majority rule. I'll accept the argument that by voting or by participating in a democratic system, you're consenting to the will of the majority, even if you're in the minority. Problem is, I never voted or agreed to it. Continuing. Taxes are no more theft than rent is extortion. It makes me wonder whether or not this guy has ever rented property before, because he seems to understand how landlords work. Mr. Nielsen, if a landlord ever forced you to pay for living on property that they didn't own, or tried making rules for property that you own, or threatened to lock you into a cage and kill you if you resist if you didn't pay your rent, let me know. That's something we can talk about your whole analogy here. Continuing. By living in that location, we are agreeing to abide by its rules and pay the charges. But what if I live on my own property? Do I have to pay someone else for permission to live on my own property? Well, by definition of property, I really shouldn't. If we don't agree, we can either change the rules or move. Again, this doesn't explain why the impetus is on me to move off property that I own because I don't want to pay a fee that someone else is imposing on me. Why doesn't the state move? If people in a certain area don't want to pay for government services or prefer to use private sector services, how about the state move to a place where people do want government services and are willing to pay? How about that? And that concludes the article. This is my first time reviewing an article. It's a nice little change of pace, but yeah, we see a lot of the common arguments in favor of taxation here, that it benefits you and you have a right to decide when you vote and you agree to it by living here, etc., and things have been debunked before. We see some interesting new stuff though, like the comparison between the government and a landlord, which isn't entirely inaccurate, because if you think about it, when you live under a landlord, you're giving up the freedom of owning your own property in exchange for not having to worry about the responsibilities of owning your own property. I think there's a similar parallel you can draw between anarchism and statism. Under anarchism, you have the rights of living on your own land, but you also have the responsibilities of living on your own land, ensuring your own protection and everything. When you agree to participate in the state, you're giving up the rights that come with living on your own land, but also giving up a lot of those responsibilities. And as a panarchist, I kind of see statism and anarchism as two different ways of doing things that can coexist rather than mutually exclusive alternatives. But, and I'm sure a lot of you will disagree with me on that, but the bottom line is I do think the landlord analogy is accurate to an extent. Where it starts to not be so accurate is in the scope. Like, the landlord can only make rules for his own property. He can't say, like the government, they can make zoning laws or building codes and tell you what to do on your own property. They can also only charge you rent or impose their rules on you if you agree to it in the terms of the lease, where the government just kind of makes rules for you. There's no negotiation process. Well, I suppose there is with the democratic process, but that's much more complicated and drawn out than just negotiating a lease. Anyways, that concludes my response to this article. I should plan on doing more article responses in the future because, again, I think it's a nice little refreshing, change of the status quo. And I do apologize for the gap in video releases. With the holidays, I was a bit busy, had some traveling going on, didn't have much time to, make videos. And hopefully in the future I can start churning out more. So definitely, if you want to see more, do subscribe. And thanks for watching. This has been Philosophossum, making stupidity play dead. Have a good one.